We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
The evidence itself was not what unsettled investigators. It was the timing. According to individuals familiar with the investigation, one of the items later examined by authorities had reportedly been recovered from a room connected to Tommaso. Publicly, very little was confirmed about the object itself. But internally, investigators were said to be concerned by something more specific. The item appeared difficult to reconcile with the timeline they had originally been working from. That distinction mattered, because by the time investigators reached that stage of the case, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was no longer being viewed simply as a missing person investigation. Too many details had already begun resisting ordinary explanations. The overnight timeline had narrowed considerably. Certain digital records no longer aligned comfortably, and several behavioral patterns connected to the case were beginning to raise additional questions quietly behind the scenes. At first, none of those issues appeared connected. Later, investigators reportedly began reconsidering that assumption. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Friends described her as deeply structured. Family members spoke about routines that rarely changed. She attended church regularly, often virtually. She answered calls. She maintained habits built carefully over years. That consistency became important almost immediately after she disappeared. On the evening before authorities believed something happened, Nancy reportedly had dinner with family before returning home to her Tucson residence. Publicly, that portion of the timeline remained relatively stable throughout the early stages of the investigation. She arrived home. The evening appeared normal. Nothing outwardly suggested disruption. But according to investigators, normal routines are often where the first contradictions begin appearing. The following morning, Nancy failed to appear for a scheduled commitment. Calls reportedly went unanswered. Concern escalated quickly enough that relatives went to check on her home themselves. What they found complicated the situation immediately. There were no publicly confirmed signs of forced entry. No obvious large-scale struggle had been identified publicly. But investigators reportedly believed several details inside the home suggested Nancy likely had not left voluntarily. Her phone remained behind. Medication was still present. Personal items someone her age would normally keep close had not been taken. That detail mattered more than many people initially realized. Because people who leave intentionally usually prepare for leaving. Nancy appeared not to have prepared at all. But investigators were beginning to notice another problem. The scene inside the residence did not feel chaotic. It felt controlled. And controlled environments tend to concern investigators for a different reason entirely. Not because they immediately indicate guilt, but because they can suggest familiarity. Someone understanding the environment well enough to move through it without creating obvious disruption. Someone aware of routines. Someone comfortable enough inside the home that nothing initially appeared dramatically out of place. That possibility quietly shifted the direction of the investigation. As authorities reconstructed the overnight timeline, two details quickly became central. The first involved Nancy's doorbell camera. According to reporting connected to the investigation, the device stopped recording during the overnight hours. Public officials never fully clarified whether the interruption resulted from malfunction, connectivity failure, or something intentional. But investigators reportedly did not dismiss the timing as coincidence. The second detail involved Nancy's pacemaker connection. The device itself had not failed. Instead, communication between the pacemaker and a nearby phone reportedly stopped transmitting during roughly the same period. That distinction became increasingly important internally because it appeared to suggest movement. Not necessarily death. Movement. Distance developing between Nancy and the device used to monitor the pacemaker data. Once investigators began placing those details side by side, the timeline narrowed significantly. A surveillance interruption. A disconnected medical transmission. No forced entry. And a woman with highly predictable routines suddenly gone. That combination reportedly shifted investigative focus away from random intrusion and towards something more structured. Something involving access. At first, authorities remained cautious publicly. Sheriff Chris Nanos repeatedly emphasized that the investigation was active and evolving. The FBI joined the case. Technical analysts reportedly began reviewing digital patterns connected to the home and surrounding area. But according to publicly discussed reporting, another layer of concern was already developing quietly behind the scenes. Behavior. Because while physical evidence reconstructs movement, behavior often reconstructs pressure. Investigators reportedly began reviewing communication patterns connected to individuals close to Nancy. Not simply what people said, but how they said it. Changes in tone. Delays in response. Emotion that appeared unusually restrained. moments where concern felt oddly procedural rather than instinctive. None of those behaviors independently prove wrongdoing. But investigators compare behavior against baseline routines constantly. And according to individuals familiar with the broader investigation, some behavioral shifts reportedly became difficult to ignore once the timeline tightened. At first, the details seemed minor. Then digital analysis complicated the picture further. Modern investigations rarely depend on a single dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, they rely on reconstruction, phone metadata, location overlap, connection logs, surveillance gaps, financial activity, message timing, patterns that individually appear harmless but collectively begin forming structure. Authorities reportedly reviewed device activity connected to areas surrounding Nancy's home during the critical overnight window. Publicly, officials released very little specific information. But Sheriff Nanos acknowledged that cellular analysis had assisted the investigation. That statement carried significant weight internally, because cellular analysis does not simply examine conversations. Often, it examines presence. Which devices appeared near a location? Which devices disappeared unexpectedly? Which devices behaved differently from their established historical patterns? And more importantly, which devices appeared somewhere investigators did not expect them to appear at all? That alone might not have dramatically shifted the investigation. But according to discussions surrounding the case, investigators later began comparing digital movement patterns against the evidence reportedly recovered from Tommaso's room. And this is where the timeline started changing. Because the importance of the evidence reportedly was not emotional. It was chronological. Investigators allegedly began questioning whether the item could comfortably exist inside the timeline they had originally constructed. If the evidence truly connected to Nancy's final known movements, then earlier assumptions about preparation, access, and sequence may no longer have aligned correctly. That realization reportedly forced authorities to revisit several assumptions simultaneously. Not just who may have been involved, but when the situation surrounding Nancy may actually have begun developing. And according to individuals following the case closely, that distinction quietly changed the direction of the investigation. Because if preparation began earlier than investigators initially believed, then certain later behaviors no longer appeared reactive. They appeared anticipatory. That possibility created another problem investigators could not ignore. It suggested the disappearance may not have emerged from a sudden event at all. Instead, portions of the environment surrounding Nancy's final days may already have been shifting before anyone realized something was wrong. Around this same period, investigators reportedly revisited communication behavior leading up to Nancy's disappearance rather than focusing exclusively on events afterward. That subtle shift mattered enormously, because investigators often pay close attention to routine disruption before a critical event occurs. Shortened conversations, unexpected silence, changes in visitation patterns, financial stress, altered tone, minor emotional distance that initially feels harmless until viewed in hindsight. And according to publicly available reporting connected to the investigation, authorities increasingly believed certain pre-disappearance behaviors deserved closer examination. Not because they conclusively established criminal intent, but because they no longer aligned comfortably with the original version of events. At approximately the midpoint of the investigation, authorities reportedly believed they were no longer dealing with isolated anomalies. The surveillance interruption, the pacemaker disconnect, the behavioral inconsistencies, the digital reconstruction, the evidence recovered from Tommaso's room, the timeline complications, the absence of forced entry. Individually, each detail remained incomplete. Together, investigators reportedly believed they were beginning to form structure. And structure changes everything in an investigation. Because once events begin appearing structured, investigators stop asking whether something unusual happened. They begin asking how long the situation had been developing before anyone recognized it. That question became even more important once authorities reportedly revisited the emotional dynamics surrounding the case. Not dramatic conflict, something quieter, controlled tension, emotionally restrained communication, unusual calmness in moments where investigators expected visible distress. Again, none of those details independently proved wrongdoing. But according to individuals following the investigation closely, authorities reportedly believe the emotional presentation surrounding portions of the case no longer fully matched the gravity of the situation itself. And that discrepancy created one final contradiction investigators could not comfortably resolve. If NancyGuthrie's disappearance had truly been sudden and unplanned, then why did so many of the details connected to the case appear to investigators as though portions of the situation had already been unfolding long before Nancy vanished at all? By the time investigators began revisiting the structure of the timeline, the investigation had already entered a very different phase internally. Publicly, the case still appeared open-ended. Searches continued. Tips continued arriving. The ransom communications still attracted attention online. But according to individuals familiar with how cases like this evolve, investigators were no longer expanding outward looking for random possibilities. They were narrowing, quietly, because several independent elements of the case were beginning to converge around the same central concern. Preparation. Not necessarily elaborate preparation. Not the kind associated with fictional crime stories. Something more practical. Familiarity with routines. Understanding of timing. Awareness of access. The ability to move through a controlled environment without creating immediate alarm. And according to publicly discussed reporting connected to the investigation, authorities increasingly believe those elements mattered more than dramatic public theories circulating online. At roughly the same stage, investigators reportedly intensified their review of activity surrounding NancyGuthrie's final confirmed evening. Initially, that portion of the timeline had appeared relatively straightforward. Dinner with family. Return home. Normal routine. But once digital reconstruction expanded, investigators allegedly began reconsidering whether certain interactions before Nancy returned home may have carried greater significance than originally believed. That shift changed the investigation considerably, because once authorities begin questioning earlier assumptions, even small details can take on new meaning. A delayed message, an unexpected visit, a conversation that suddenly ended differently than usual. Minor irregularities that initially appeared harmless can later become structurally important once investigators establish broader context. And according to individuals following the investigation closely, context was becoming increasingly important in Nancy's case, especially surrounding communication behavior. Investigators reportedly revisited phone records, contact frequency, and message timing involving individuals connected to Nancy during the days leading up to her disappearance. Not because any single interaction appeared immediately suspicious, but because authorities were beginning to compare communication patterns against established routines. That process often reveals pressure long before overt conflict becomes visible. Shortened responses, abrupt tone shifts, unexpected silence, changes in availability, emotion becoming increasingly controlled or distant. And according to publicly discussed reporting surrounding the investigation, some of those behavioral patterns reportedly became difficult for authorities to fully dismiss once the forensic timeline tightened. At the same time, another issue quietly continued drawing attention internally. Financial pressure, not dramatic financial collapse. Something subtler. Investigators reportedly began reviewing whether stress connected to money, property, or future obligations may have existed beneath the surface long before Nancy disappeared. Because financial pressure often behaves quietly at first. Private tension, careful conversations, controlled frustration, changes in behavior surrounding access, inheritance, or long-term planning. Those details rarely appear criminal on their own. But when investigators begin seeing them alongside timeline inconsistencies and behavioral shifts, they start asking different questions. Not whether conflict existed, but whether the conflict had been escalating privately for longer than anyone initially realized. That distinction reportedly became important once authorities revisited evidence recovered during the broader investigation, particularly the item connected to Tommaso's room. Again, officials publicly confirmed very little about the evidence itself. But according to individuals closely following developments in the case, investigators allegedly became increasingly interested in how the item interacted with chronology. Not motive. Chronology. Could the object realistically fit within the established sequence of events investigators originally believed had occurred? Or did its existence suggest earlier preparation? That question reportedly triggered another quiet wave of digital reconstruction. Phone metadata was reportedly revisited repeatedly, not simply looking for location, looking for repetition, repeated proximity, repeated timing overlap, repeated movement patterns. Because once investigators suspect preparation, isolated moments stop appearing isolated. Instead, they begin resembling stages of the same process unfolding gradually over time. And according to individuals familiar with the investigation, that possibility increasingly concerned authorities, especially because the case still lacked one element investigators normally rely on heavily: clear disorder. Nancy's home reportedly continued presenting the same unusual characteristic investigators had noticed from the beginning. Control. No publicly confirmed forced entry. No publicly described chaotic struggle. No obvious signs of hurried intrusion. That absence mattered. Because random events tend to create disruption. Controlled events often create gaps instead. Missing explanations, carefully maintained routines, emotion that appears slightly disconnected from circumstance. And according to publicly discussed reporting connected to the investigation, authorities increasingly believe the emotional dynamics surrounding portions of the case deserved closer examination. Investigators reportedly analyzed interview behavior carefully, not searching for dramatic breakdowns. Something quieter, changes in wording, pauses before answers, moments where concern appeared rehearsed rather than instinctive. Over-explaining minor details while avoiding broader emotional context. Again, none of those observations independently establish wrongdoing. But investigators compare emotional presentation against expected behavioral baselines constantly. And once multiple inconsistencies begin appearing alongside forensic complications, investigative focus narrows naturally. Around this stage of the investigation, another subtle issue reportedly became increasingly important. Timing overlap. Not simply where devices appeared, but when. Because cellular analysis does not just reconstruct movement. It reconstructs sequence. Which device arrived first? Which disconnected unexpectedly? Which remained active longer than expected? And according to individuals familiar with similar forensic methods, sequence analysis can become critically important once investigators begin questioning whether an event was spontaneous or anticipated. That distinction reportedly became central internally. Because if portions of the environment surrounding Nancy's disappearance had already been shifting beforehand, then certain behaviors afterward no longer appeared accidental. They appeared managed. At roughly the midpoint of the investigation, authorities reportedly began separating information connected to the case into two categories: emotionally persuasive details and structurally reliable ones. That separation mattered enormously. Public speculation often focused on visible emotion, online theories, or ransom communications. Investigators reportedly focused elsewhere: timeline stability, behavioral consistency, digital overlap, access patterns. Those are the foundations cases are usually built on. And according to individuals following the investigation closely, those foundations increasingly appeared to be pointing investigators toward a more concentrated field of concern. Not publicly, internally, because by then, authorities reportedly no longer believed they were dealing with unrelated anomalies. The surveillance interruption, the pacemaker disconnect, the unusual communication behavior, the evolving forensic interpretation, the evidence recovered from Tommaso's room, the emotional inconsistencies, the financial pressure questions. Separately, each detail remained incomplete. Together, investigators allegedly believed they were beginning to reveal something more concerning. Not a sudden event, a developing situation. That interpretation reportedly changed the emotional tone of the investigation considerably. Because if the disappearance emerged from circumstances developing quietly over time, then NancyGuthrie may not have unknowingly entered a random crisis that night. She may have been moving inside an environment investigators were beginning to suspect had already changed around her long before she vanished. As investigators continued narrowing the timeline, one reality reportedly became increasingly difficult to ignore internally. The case no longer appeared fragmented. It appeared layered. And layered investigations often develop in a very specific way. At first, the evidence seems disconnected. A surveillance interruption, a missing timeline window, an unexplained behavioral shift, a piece of evidence found somewhere investigators did not expect. Individually, each detail feels incomplete. But over time, investigators begin noticing something more important. The same patterns continue appearing around all of them. That reportedly became the central concern in the NancyGuthrie investigation. Not one dramatic discovery. Repetition, repeated familiarity, repeated access, repeated timing overlap, repeated behavioral inconsistencies surrounding the same increasingly narrow circle of attention. By this stage, authorities reportedly believed the case had moved far beyond the possibility of random intrusion. Too many elements appeared structured. Nancy's routines were highly predictable. The overnight movement window remained unusually controlled. The digital reconstruction reportedly continued suggesting intentionality rather than chaos. And according to publicly discussed reporting connected to the investigation, authorities increasingly believed familiarity remained one of the most important factors in understanding what happened. Because familiarity changes everything. It explains how someone enters an environment quietly. It explains how routines can be anticipated. It explains how movement occurs without immediate alarm. And perhaps most importantly, it explains why certain details inside the home reportedly appeared emotionally inconsistent from the very beginning. That emotional inconsistency continued drawing quiet attention internally. Investigators reportedly remained focused not only on what individuals said after Nancy disappeared, but how they behaved while saying it. Emotional restraint, controlled wording, measured presentation. Again, none of those behaviors independently establish guilt. People process stress differently. Investigators understand that. But according to individuals familiar with the broader structure of the case, authorities allegedly became increasingly interested in moments where emotional presentation appeared disconnected from expected circumstance. Not exaggerated calmness, something subtler. A level of emotional control that felt difficult to fully reconcile with the uncertainty surrounding Nancy's disappearance. That concern reportedly became more significant once investigators revisited communication behavior leading up to the overnight timeline itself. Because by then, authorities were no longer focused solely on the night Nancy vanished. They were examining the days before it. And according to individuals closely following developments in the investigation, several patterns reportedly became difficult to interpret as coincidence once viewed collectively. Changes in communication frequency, periods of unusual silence, subtle shifts in tone, behavior that initially appeared harmless until investigators compared it against established routines. That process reportedly altered the investigation profoundly. Because once authorities begin suspecting preparation rather than spontaneity, earlier details take on entirely different meaning. A routine visit no longer feels routine. A delayed message no longer feels insignificant. A familiar presence no longer appears neutral. Instead, investigators begin asking whether the environment surrounding the victim had already been changing quietly before the disappearance occurred publicly. At the same time, forensic reconstruction reportedly continued focusing heavily on chronology. Not motive, not speculation. Sequence. Which events occurred first? Which details appeared reactive? Which behaviors appeared anticipatory? And according to individuals familiar with similar investigations, that distinction often determines whether authorities believe an event emerged impulsively or through gradual preparation. That question reportedly became central internally, especially after authorities revisited the evidence recovered from Tommaso's room. Again, publicly confirmed information surrounding the item remained extremely limited. But according to discussions surrounding the case, investigators allegedly believe the significance of the evidence was tied less to ownership and more to timing. Could the item realistically exist where it was found without earlier preparation already taking place? That possibility reportedly forced investigators to reconsider one of the earliest assumptions made in the case, that the disappearance began during the overnight window itself. Because by then, authorities increasingly appeared to believe the overnight timeline may only represent the moment the situation became visible, not the moment it truly began. That realization quietly reframed everything. The surveillance interruption looked different. The pacemaker disconnect looked different. The communication patterns looked different. Even the ransom messages reportedly began receiving different interpretation internally. At first, the messages created the appearance of movement and negotiation. Later, investigators allegedly became more focused on their instability, changing amounts, contradictory language, shifting tone, because unstable communication can sometimes indicate something important, not control, pressure. And pressure changes behavior over time. It creates mistakes, inconsistencies, emotional fractures. That is one reason investigators reportedly continued revisiting earlier interviews and communication records repeatedly, not searching for dramatic confessions, searching for deviation. The moment someone's established behavior stopped matching itself. According to individuals following the investigation closely, authorities allegedly believe those deviations were becoming increasingly important, especially because the case still contained one unresolved contradiction investigators could not comfortably eliminate. NancyGuthrie's disappearance reportedly appeared both controlled and unstable at the same time. Controlled in structure, unstable in behavior afterward. And that combination rarely fits random events cleanly. It often suggests something else entirely. An environment where pressure had already been building long before the central event occurred. By the final stage of the investigation's early reconstruction, authorities reportedly appeared less focused on broad public theories and more focused on narrowing continuity. Who remained consistently connected to the timeline? Who remained consistently connected to the environment? Who remained consistently connected to the behavioral shifts investigators had identified? Because investigations do not usually narrow through dramatic breakthroughs. They narrow through repetition. And according to publicly discussed reporting surrounding the case, repetition was becoming increasingly difficult for investigators to ignore. The same names, the same access points, the same communication patterns, the same emotional inconsistencies, the same timeline complications. One by one, the unrelated details reportedly stopped behaving like isolated anomalies. They began behaving like parts of the same structure. And that realization reportedly created the most disturbing implication investigators had faced yet. If the evidence recovered from Tommaso's room truly altered the timeline the way authorities allegedly believed it did, then Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may not have been the beginning of the case at all. It may have been the moment a much longer process finally became impossible to hide.